Hi, good afternoon. That is a little loud. My name is J.R. Storment. I'm the Chief Customer Officer at Cloudability and one of the co-founders. And in my role, I'm really lucky to work with a lot of really big Amazon spenders. We have customers like GE and Adobe and Intuit who use us to really manage their spending and their growth on Amazon. And the talk that I'm going to give today is all about how we've seen companies like these employ techniques that really create a culture of cost accountability in their companies, or cost management. So a lot of the information we have in here and the strategies and tactics come from things that we've seen work in the real world. So I'm going to outline this talk across a few different ways. I'm first going to go into a little bit of story about how we've seen companies grow in cloud. And then I'm going to basically give some case study examples of what we've seen work and some tips you can take home, hopefully on Monday even when you get back from the show to start implementing some better cost management in your company. So let's start with the story. So this is generally how we've seen cloud growth grow within a company. And this could be a small startup. It could be a giant enterprise. They tend to all sort of follow the same curve. On the y-axis here, we have dollars. So small startup, it may be hundreds or thousands. Large enterprise, it could be hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. And the y-axis is time. Let's call this 2 years, for example. So in the beginning, the early days of cloud growth, it's generally dev and test. People are spinning up greenfield resources, and they're starting to do this mainly because they want to get access to servers more quickly. They want agility. And the cloud is great for that. But often what we see not long after those initial tests is some sort of little hiccup that happens, or an involuntary load test, if you will, where somebody spins up a bunch of resources that they didn't mean to, or they didn't mean to leave on for very long, and they spend a little more than they meant to. So after that, there's usually a quick correction. Some basic cost management tools are put in place. And not long after that, we see the first POC land. And generally, companies have done enough research. The first POC goes pretty well. And they start to then roll out things into production. So the first app hits. News of that going well spreads. The second app hits. The third app hits. And things start to scale from there. Now, up until this point, the focus is really on getting things out the door. It's about getting things live. It's about making sure nothing falls over. Let's get this thing into production. There's not a lot of focus before then on cost and on being more efficient and on reducing your utilization when you don't need to be using as much. So as things scale, though, and continue up and to the right, invariably, companies hit a point where this happens. Somebody on an exec team or pretty far up starts to really care about the spending. And they say, whoa, we gotta get this under control. We need to put in some cost measures. We need to see what's happening. And this is usually the stage that a lot of the companies that we work with come to us, which is they've got things into production, they're really starting to scale, and now they need to go back and look to see how they could be more efficient. So what I'm going to talk through in this talk is really the methodology we've seen companies use when they hit this stage. And the most efficient ones we've seen all seem to use about the same 5-stage life cycle. And I'll go through those 5 stages here in just a minute. First, I wanted to talk about why this needs to be cultural inside of a company. Why can't it just be a basic process or some software that we launch? And the reason is that cloud is no longer one person's responsibility. Early days, it was a few developers, maybe rogue developers, who were spinning up resources. Now you've got a whole slew of people who not only influence the costs, but also really need to see them on a regular basis. So from the left here, the engineers need to see when I spin up resources, this is the effect on the bill at the end of the month. Finance people need to do accruals. They need to do reporting. They need to do closes at the end of the month. The operations folks are making often big-scale changes to the infrastructure that can have massive impact on costs. So they need to see what those are going to do. Then you have budget owners or capacity planners who, in this process, are trying to track against a budget that they've committed to. And finally, you've got execs. And the execs need to set goals. They need to understand also, more importantly, I think, what is the impact of our cloud spending on our product's margins or our company's margins? And how can we tie that to unit cost? And we'll talk a bit more about unit cost here toward the end of the talk. So how do you build that culture? Well, there's some basic pieces you start with. First is getting data into the hands of the right people. And it's not just 1 or 2 of those groups. It's really all 5. How do we get the people who need this amount of spending for this part of this production in this linked account, that bit of the spending on a regular basis? How do we also get policies in place and evangelize best practices? And you need to do this because at most companies, scaling on cloud is a totally new thing. Even if they've been in there for years with smaller resources, running all your infrastructure on cloud requires new tools for engineers. It requires new understanding for finance teams. And finally, you want to incentivize the good behavior that you get when you put these things in place, because you don't want to end up or you want people self-policing. You don't want to put in a bunch of watchdogs who essentially have to go chasing everybody through the process. So this is the 5-stage program that we've seen the big companies that we work with at Amazon employ really effectively. And the first stage is basic cost visibility. This boils down to one simple thing, which is let's eliminate surprises. We don't ever want to end up at the end of the month with a bill that is higher than we thought it was going to be, or a lot higher than we thought it was going to be. So let's get emails and alerts and updates on the spending on a regular basis, and let's have dashboards that show us how we're trending. The next stage is allocating costs between departments, or where are my dollars going, rather? So how do we split up our spending between departments, between business units, and using things like tags and linked accounts in the process. The third stage, which is often the most skipped stage, it's a really fun one, but people like to go right past it, which is how do we efficiently use only what we need? So how do we make sure that as we're spinning things up, we're turning them back off when we don't need them, and we're turning off underutilized instances as well through the process? The fourth stage, which is probably everyone's favorite, is how do we save money on what we're using? So things like reserved instances, for example. And people often try to skip to this stage without doing the third one, which ends up in a world where you are buying reservations for things you don't necessarily need. So the fifth stage in this process is how do we start to tie all that spending we're doing, all the resources we're using, to the bottom line, so that we can see what the impact of our spending is on the margins and track things like unit costs so we can separate out why the bill is growing. So this cycle is definitely a linear one. It is one that you want to go through in the order that we laid out there for maximum efficiency, but it is also a very continuous cycle. It's cyclical, because new resources are always popping up. You've got new projects coming online, you've got new people joining the company, you've got new resources firing up. So you want to make sure to continuously revisit this process. So I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on each of these 5 and talk about both some strategies and some tactics that you can employ. So basic cost visibility. At the core of anybody using a cloud service, there's really 2 people in the company. There's those who are incurring the costs and those who are watching the costs. And in most companies, what we see happen is there are a lot of these people. There are developers, there are operations people, there are people spinning up resources and getting what they need, but only a few people on the other side of the house. Maybe the tasked finance person who is supposed to watch this, or a really interested exec, or an obsessed product manager who wants to track their budget. And what we want to move toward is a world where you really need a balance between the watchers and the incurrers. And it doesn't necessarily mean putting in more watchdogs or more process. It means for the people who are incurring costs, making sure that they're equipped with the right data to also watch the spending they're doing, and that for the watchers, that there are a variety of folks in the organization doing it. So you never really have a place where one person is responsible for watching the whole house. So some basic tips to get you started in these levels. First, get each stakeholder the spending fundamentals daily. Get them just their spending, what they need to know, so they can see how their choices affect the spending later on the week, the next day, the next month, et cetera. And as much as possible, you want to let each team see everyone else's spending habits. This creates an incentivization to or sort of a good social pressure, if you will, for people to behave responsibly. And one of the great ways to do this is to create really broadly available dashboards with this information and put those in the workplaces of the engineering and operations team so everybody can see how things trend as a new deployment goes out or as a change in the infrastructure happens. So Cloudability offers some really great tools to help deliver this type of visibility. You're seeing this kind of hot off the presses. This is a brand new dashboarding feature we launched yesterday here at reInvent, and it's really great because it's a completely widgetized system. So you can take any cost data you want, your spending data, your instance types, your usage types, anything you want, and create just the view of the spending that you want. Everything here is customizable, widgetizable, and you can direct it to just show the spending for any part of your infrastructure that you'd like. So this is a really easy way to get that process started. And I want to talk a little about how we've seen the scale at larger companies. So this is a customer of ours. They're actually in the process of moving hundreds of applications onto AWS. They're I think just about a Fortune 500 company. And what they've done is they've taken their detailed billing reports and adjusted them into Cloudability, and they've actually split all their different business units and groups and departments into 750 different views. And these are very small slices. This is this project in production, or this international spending in dev. And they've given basically each of their users, their watchers and their incurrers, the ability, and there's about 800 people in the organization who actually get this visibility, about 10% of their company, get daily emails from Cloudability that say, here's what you spent, here's where you're going to end up, here's what changes are happening. So at the same time, they've got oversight to do the general reporting for finance. And this quote at the bottom here I think is really key, which is, they want to put control of AWS resources in each product team's hands. They want to get out of the way, but at the same time, they still need to maintain oversight. And I think that really sums up what you want to strive for in this stage. So the next stage is allocation. We've gotten through the surprises. We're not going to have anything happen that we didn't expect. Now we need to figure out where the dollars are going and why that's happening. So the first thing in this really is to get a lot of people involved. We said there's finance people, there's operations, there's engineers. They're all going to want to see the spending in different ways. They're going to want to report financially versus operationally. Some are going to want to see by environment. Some are going to want to see by role. And in a lot of companies, there's a lot of complexity like this. You've got a ton of business units, ton of products, cost centers, or even in a smaller company, a lot of services. So in order to start splitting up those giant data files that Amazon delivers, they've got, if you're not familiar with them, they've got these detailed billing reports that basically deliver line items that are so detailed that some of the largest customers get hundreds of millions of row CSV files every month with all their resource data. So very detailed information, but the devil's really in the details on how you split that out. So before you start going in there and carving it up, make sure you get consensus around how people want to split the spending. And there's really two tools that you have for splitting up your spending. You've got tags, and you've got linked accounts. And tags are great. They're very flexible. You can put about 10 of them on any resource. You can change them over time. But the issue with tags is they're difficult to get full coverage because compliance is hard. Somebody needs to set a tag when a resource is deployed or after the fact. The other way you can do it is with linked accounts. These are separate accounts that you create that roll up under a consolidated billing master payer account. They offer really clean chargeback because if a resource pops up in a production account, you know it's production even if nobody did the tagging. So this structure that's in the diagram here is the way that we've seen companies be most effective at this, which the linked accounts, I'm going to see if the laser pointer works. Yep. So this first group here on the left, the linked accounts, the blue ones, they would represent products or environments. So maybe I've got one for product A and production, another one for product B and dev. And then below that, splitting down by tags to get the more operational data. So roles, services, nodes, clusters, the things that if they don't get tagged, you're not going to break your financial reporting, that you can go back and change later. So the best division we've seen is financial splits in linked accounts and operational splits in tags. Cloudability, once you've done this, offers some really flexible ways to start carving that spending up. So you can create some really great custom views where you can set filters that say, just show me spending that's in the US division that has environment tag contains prod and is an account or is not an account ID this. And then once you've set up those different views, you can take those and you can assign them to individual people so that that person can see just their spending and can make better decisions as a result. So a couple takeaways on the allocating costs. Again, get consensus on the taxonomy before you start carving things up. But we found that letting finance or somebody on the finance side sort of drive that process and help inform it is useful because they often have the most complex reporting requirements. And you also want to try to define a small set, 2 or 3 mandatory tags that every resource should have. Project, environment, role. And the key thing with this is, as much as possible, try and require that those resources are tagged with these 3 tags before they go out. Put an automation in place so that resources automatically get a tag when they're deployed. We've seen a lot of companies try and tag after the fact, and it works often, but sometimes they don't, things fall over and tags don't get applied and they're stuck trying to untangle the bill. So tag on deployment, really. The next is, if tagging is really important to splitting out your infrastructure, consider putting in a tag or terminate rule. This basically means if an instance has been up for 24 hours and a tag is not applied, we're going to stop it, ideally programmatically, or at least send a warning to the person who has deployed the instance. So how does this scale? This is a great example, another company that we worked with for a number of years that has over 500 different linked accounts within a consolidated billing structure. And what's interesting about them is that a lot of these accounts, or most of them, were set up without a lot of oversight. There were hundreds of different people creating these accounts sort of ad hoc at will. And so they went through the similar type of process where they basically used linked accounts to split out those product and environments, and including splitting regions. So if you had product A in US prod, that would be one account. Product A, US international, product A, US dev, et cetera. And that let them basically, on top of that, they ingested SAP data, and they put that into Cloudability, in fact, and created basically account grouping metadata to say, these accounts align to this cost center, and these 5 accounts are part of this business unit. And in whatever way the finance folks wanted to split out the spending, they put that on top of there. And this enabled them to charge back in a way that didn't just align to the operational view of the business, meaning how the linked accounts were set up, but it's actually aligned to how finance needs to do the financial reporting. So third stage, efficiency. I think there's the most meat and things you can do in this stage, but as I mentioned, the one that people like to skip over the most. What I love about this stage is when you think about why it's important, you look at a week, and a week has 168 hours in it. Each and every week, same amount. The thing is, 108 of those hours are nights and weekends. And I'm guessing that most people had a lot of dev and test resources running that aren't necessarily being worked on all the time. And unless you've got 24/7 dev teams, there's a good chance that you can turn a lot of these resources off. So we like to say, don't run the cloud like you'd run a data center. To make sure that during those 65% of the hours in a month that are nights and weekends, that if you can turn things down, shut them down. So there's a ton of ways that you can optimize all across Amazon and save money. I'm going to focus here on a few easy wins specifically for EC2, because that's where the majority of the spending is for a lot of people. So the first one is turn off underutilized instances. There's a really easy strategy here. Look at things like low CPU, low bandwidth, low disk I/O. And within a report like this, which is a Cloudability report, you can get really detailed in filtering down to just the development tag or just production. And because we've split things up in those previous steps, we're able to then carve out different thresholds for different types of instances, different types of resources. And ideally, then, you end up scheduling this type of report to the responsible people every week so they can see, I have this many resources that need to be turned down, sized, or turned off, sized down, or resized in some way. The next thing is focus on scheduling downtime for dev and test resources. Again, you've got all those hours that are potentially non-working hours. And you can take a report like this from Cloudability as well, which is looking at every hour of the day of a reporting period. And you'll generally see this same pattern, which is the second column, which is running instances, is almost always flat. Not always, but it's usually pretty close to flat for most companies. So there's huge savings potential there, even to turn off instances for 4 hours on a Sunday or just 1 day a week. Another big win is finding old instance families that can be migrated to newer instance families. So the classic one is M1s. A lot of M1 usage out there still, really solid workhorse instance, but there are newer instance families that are both faster and cheaper. The downside is that most of them have much smaller hard drives. And so what you want to do is actually look for instances that don't appear to be using those drives very much. So the ones that have EBS volumes attached and that have low disk access on their ephemeral disks. So you could build a report like this where we're filtering into, just show me instance type contains M1 that has disk access of less than a gig and has at least one storage device attached. And you can save anywhere from 3 to 10 cents an hour on that. So a lot of folks, we've seen are running tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of hours of M1s. You do that migration, you get faster running boxes and some pretty sizable savings. So one of the ways we can also help with this is once you've set up some of those thresholds is we can set reporting alerts essentially when those thresholds are crossed. So set it up to come daily or hourly or weekly, whatever threshold is important to you. And there's that great little send report even if there's no content box, which if you uncheck that means that the report will not go out unless there are resources that match the criteria. So you can set up very complicated and granular alerting systems based on just unchecking that and getting the report every hour if a resource suddenly fits the criteria. So some takeaways on encouraging efficient behavior here in stage 3. Definitely automate the waste reporting. Filter down to what you think is the right mix of CPU, bandwidth, et cetera, and then get those reports going to people every week so they can self-police. As much as possible, if you can gamify the cleanup process, this gets back to creating dashboards or leaderboards of who's being most efficient. And we've seen a lot of companies get together a monthly or quarterly in some cases cadence of a whole company review, where they basically have a group that gets together to review how much waste they had in the last month and start to use that as a good talking place to make better changes the next month. So as I mentioned, there's a bunch of ways you can optimize. I'm going to leave this section of this there, but there's a great talk on Friday by a customer of ours, HDST, at 1 p.m. that dives a lot further into a lot of optimization techniques and efficiency techniques they've used on EC2, if you want to check that out. So quick case study in the efficiency world. Worked with a great company in Australia called realestate.com.au. And they put together what they called Midge's Law. This is one of their engineers. His name is Midge. Awesome guy. And he basically took a bunch of data from our API, things like CPU and the age of the nodes and how long the nodes have been up, all kinds of things, and combined those into a score. It was sort of like a golf score. If a resource has a high count or high score, it's bad. We want to get it shut down. If it's got a low score, it's likely doing better. And they applied this to dev and test resources specifically. And they basically created a leaderboard where every group had their score put out against this formula. And this formula may not be right for everybody, but it's the type of thing you can start to think about as you scale and realize that there's potentially a lot of things you could be doing to save some money. So everybody's favorite stage, the saving stage. This stage really, I think, falls into two buckets, spot instances and reserved instances. So spot instances are a really powerful tool. They're much, much cheaper than on-demand, but they do come up and down. You're not guaranteed the amount of time you have them. And so there's some great gains you can have there, but it does take some work to manage that market. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to focus on reserved instances because they are ones that require no engineering time. Finance can go in there. They can autonomously buy RIs. They can save, check the Amazon website, many, many percentage points over the on-demand rates. So they're a really easy win. The first thing we see with RIs, though, if I can click. Ooh, there we go, is that people have some fear about them. They're afraid that Amazon lowers the prices all the time. What if they lower them so much and I'm suddenly underwater on my RI? I mean, they've lowered them 42 times in the last X number of years. I'm making that up, but it's been a lot. And so we actually did some research where we looked at all the price cuts over the last 3 or 4 years, and we compared those. Clicker is still being crazy here. We compared those price cuts to the RI prices. And what we found is that as long as you used your RIs 50% of the time, there was never a point where you were underwater on that purchase. The on-demand rate was always more expensive than what you would have paid for the RI, even with all those successive price cuts. And what was even more interesting was that the 3-year RIs, it turned out, in almost all cases, there was a brief period, I think in 2012 or something, you can check the blog post there, where the 3-year RIs were always a better deal than the 1-year RIs. So definitely something to explore if you're not looking at them heavily. So another important thing with reserved instances is that you want to buy based on your current hourly data. And there's two parts to that. There's the current part and the hourly part. The hourly is important because Amazon applies the reservations each and every hour. They're looking this hour, this hour, this hour. How many of this instance type do you have? So you want to use this type of graph like a frequency distribution to see how many instances each hour you're running and make the recommendations based on that. Cloudability has some great tools for that. You can check it out if you want. But the other great thing about this is, or the other interesting thing, sorry, there's hourly cost and then current, is that we see a lot of companies trying to buy based just on forecasts or what's going to happen, what's coming down the road. We want to buy reservations for 3 months from now, 6 months from now. In the meantime, they end up not buying anything at all because they get in sort of an analysis paralysis where they want to get just the right buy and they want to get everybody's input and they want to make sure that all the teams have shared their plans for scaling. So as much as possible, we encourage folks to really make a small purchase right away if you can, because during that analysis time, which is usually planned to be a few weeks and we've seen go to 3, 6, 9 months, you spend a lot of time running resources on demand. So getting to a place where you can make a small purchase up front is going to be really helpful. In terms of getting this into your organization, the biggest change that I think has been most impactful with the customers we worked with is them appointing a person who owns reserved instances. It may not be a person, maybe it's a team, but making it somebody's business. Because RIs are sort of a strange thing that fall between operations and finance and who makes the decision, who makes the final call. So putting it in one person's camp or a group's camp makes sure it happens. Often we find it's a tech-minded finance person, maybe a technical program manager. It's probably driven by finance, but it's on their shoulders. And as soon as you get in there and start doing the analysis, finding where there's a small and uncontroversial buy. Great one that we work with a lot of our customers on, if you see a few folks out here who I made this recommendation to, is start with M3s in US East 1A or US East because they're highly modifiable. And it's likely that at some point in the next 1 to 3 years, you are going to be needing M3s in US East 1A. Maybe you use a lot of CC2 8X larges. They're very expensive. You're running them 100%. Buy some of those. Just buy something to get started. And then moving forward, get an iterative schedule going where you're buying on a schedule that is really sacred. that you've said at this day every month, we're going to have the analysis done and we're going to make a purchase. So at scale, great example of how this works. Another customer we work with that has 12, 13,000 daily instances they're running, they've got a very strict schedule they apply to this, which is on the 25th of the month, the small team gets together, they do the analysis, they take minimal inputs from the product teams because they're not so much interested in what they think they're going to do, but looking at all these different groups and combining that usage together, what are they actually using right now? Before they make any purchase on about the 26th, they actually go and make reserved instance modifications. So if you're not familiar with modifications, they basically let you take a reservation that you own, and they let you split it out into a different type within the same family. So if you have an M3 large, you can split it into M3 mediums. If you have it in US East 1A, you can put it in US East 1B. They're really the fastest and easiest way to save money on Amazon because you are maximizing usage of a sunk cost that you've already put out there. So if you're not using modifications right now, highly recommend checking them out. And once you've done those modifications each month to make sure you're getting the most use of the reservations you already own, then go and make that purchase. Ideally, right toward the end of the month, so you're going into the new month with a reservation portfolio that really closely aligns to what your infrastructure is actually doing. So I could probably spend hours talking about reserved instances. There's a ton of detail here. But there's a great talk at 4:30 I don't have the room number in here, unfortunately, but on iterating your way to 95% RI coverage. So definitely check that out if you want more info. So the fifth stage, final stage. So unit cost. Unit cost is really interesting because if you look at this graph again, you'll focus in, if we focus in on this part where the exec team starts to really care, this is where unit cost comes in handy. So when companies hit that point and suddenly there's all this pressure on cost control, we usually see this happen. They then go back and they start focusing on efficiency and reservations. So they turn off instances that aren't being used, they size some things down, maybe schedule some nights and weekends going off. Then they buy some RIs. And everybody kind of pats themselves on the back. We did a bunch of work. It was looking good. And then the next month, what happens is the bill still goes up. And that exec member, or whoever it was, is suddenly less happy than they were before. But the bill doesn't go up as steeply because they made a bunch of changes. So why did the bill go up? Was it because the RIs weren't right, or they didn't turn off the right resources? Well, maybe not. Maybe what it was is that we started using more resources because we have more traffic. Our business is growing. We have more users, whatever it is. So unit cost is really your friend to help split that out. And it helps you tell the story within your company that an increasing bill isn't necessarily a bad thing. It may mean that your business is growing. So unit cost can tease that out. It's a very simple metric, but it's very powerful. And you can do it with a number of different business metrics. Common ones are cost per subscriber, page view, customer, API call. If you have basically a small value or unit of value that you're delivering, you want to do that as a unit cost. And the focus on unit cost is really reducing it over time, even though your total bill may be going up, because it's going to give you the best indication of how the spending is affecting your margins and the actual ROI on your cloud spend, rather than just sort of an arbitrary total cost number, which doesn't really correlate to much. So here's how you calculate it. You basically take your total cost and you divide it by the business metric of your choosing. It's really straightforward. So if you spend $1,000 this month, you have 1,000 customers, you have a $1 unit cost. So that's a really simplified version, but we've seen some companies doing some really interesting scaled versions of this. And this is actually a scaled web business. It's a well-known web brand that has just a few products they sell, but very, very high traffic, high spenders on Amazon. And they've actually started pushing unit costs throughout their entire organization and giving each person within that list of influencers the ability to look at unit cost instead of just total cost while they work. So the product owners, they're looking at it daily so they can tie the spending to revenue. Operations is examining how changes in infrastructure tie back to unit cost. You've got finance who's reporting on it with margin impacts. And I think most interestingly, they're moving toward a world where the VPs set goals based on unit costs. So instead of saying, we're not going to spend more than X next month, they say, let's make sure we don't spend more than $5 a customer. And as long as we're never doing that, it doesn't really matter what we're spending, because we're adding customers, the spending's going up, we're making more money, everything's good. So it makes for a much easier conversation internally. A shortcut to this, if you have a very simple infrastructure, maybe just one app, is to track your AWS bill as a percentage of revenue for that app. It's sort of a faux unit cost, but it's a good way to get there quickly. So those are the 5 stages. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some things you can do next. Hopefully you'll all get back home safely and get rehydrated and out of the casino air. And on Monday, here's some things that you can start with. So first and foremost, try and get visibility to the stakeholders in whatever format you can. Get them, use us to get them a daily mail, split it out in a spreadsheet, whatever you need to do, but make sure that people incurring costs are actually seeing the costs on a daily basis. Start working on that taxonomy. So get together the relevant people and figure out how you want to split up spending before you do it. You don't have to do it on Monday, but start thinking about how you want to break it down. Is it by business unit or product or cost center? What's important to break out? In the efficiency, take a look at your underutilized instances, things with low CPU, low bandwidth, low disk I/O, and check out candidates that can move from M1 to M3. Those are usually really easy wins. In the savings standpoint, what's that small, uncontroversial purchase? The one that is like, oh, we have these servers that are running. They've been going for 2 years. They're running 100% of the time. They're going to keep running. Let's just buy those. We'll get everything else later. Figure out what the low-hanging fruit is. And finally, it may take a while to get to unit cost. A lot of companies, even the giant scaled ones, are still sort of refining this and trying to get there. But figure out what the metric might be. And try dividing your total count of customers last month with your total bill to get a benchmark for where you're starting. I think in order to put this all together, though, we've seen companies be most successful with getting this, a support group, if you will. Try and put together a cost management group or a working group that gets together every month or every quarter to encourage best practices. Because without this being something that is really sort of in the bones of everybody with data in their face on a daily basis, it's too easy just to think about scaling and not worry about the cost until finance is bugging you a month or two later. So great, if you want to chat further, we definitely have a lot of areas that we can help with this, as I showed a few screenshots. We have a booth downstairs in the Expo Hall. Happy to walk you through any of this, but I'd love to open it up now for questions, if anyone has any. Yes?
We've been expanding our usage of Amazon, of AWS services, and so originally we were kind of looking at cost per engineer, but as we expand our usage of Amazon, of AWS services, that cost per engineer would go up even with our eyes that we purchase and whatnot. Is there some way we can make sure that, like, we just say, oh, by EC2 only, and not worry about those other systems?
So why were you doing it by engineer, out of curiosity?
Why are we doing it by engineer?
I will. I'll get the full detail, and then I'll repeat the question. You were splitting it by engineer just to see, as you added engineers, how much the bill would go up, essentially?
We wanted to make sure that as we're making purchases, that at least our cost per engineer was going down, even though we were adding engineers. Because our total cost was going up.
Got it. Yeah, I think so. The question is, as they're adding people using AWS and adding engineers, and they're expecting the cost to go up at a certain level, they want to make sure to track the unit cost per engineer in their case to make sure that's going down, and how to make that easier to do, essentially.
Well, we add other AWS services, so the actual cost per engineer is going up because maybe we start using RDS or maybe we start using
Right.
something else. But you're saying maybe this is just for EC2 only?
Overall, I think the unit cost is universal. You want to track it against everything. The EC2 focus I was doing mainly on just some of the efficiency hacks, ways to get more out of your dollars there. But in terms of tracking unit costs, you really do want to look at all the spending. And that's, I think, doubly important because some of the spending is harder to track. I mean, EC2 is easily taggable. Bandwidth is a little harder to divvy out. So you definitely want to look at the whole bill. Anybody else? Yeah, so how are we getting utilization data? So Cloudability collects 2 different sources. We take from CloudWatch to get all the instance level data about CPU, bandwidth, et cetera. There's no agents or anything to install. And then we also collect the detailed billing report files, which are the giant CSVs that get...
We have to send that up, right?
You basically create a read-only IAM user that only has access to the cost and usage data. And then we collect that on our own. GE is publicly a customer. I'll leave it at that. We can talk afterwards. Yes?
In the early stages, what do you find is a good recommendation? Because the people that incur costs typically don't have budgetary responsibilities, and the ones that are watching the costs do, but don't necessarily have the technical
I think it's a lot of training and education. You know, getting the finance people talking to the people incurring the costs so they can understand what they should expect, and also getting people aligned around the idea that the spending is not, it's variable spending. It can go up and down at any speed, but it's not something that is just left to chance, that we do have budgets that we're trying to track, even if they're small initially, and that we're trying to track against those. I think that, you know, cloud in general poses an interesting challenge for finance people who need to understand how to do the chargeback and in an OpEx world versus a CapEx world. So, I mean, Amazon has a ton of great resources on that. There's a bunch on our blog. It's blog.cloudability.com. We have training resources to kind of lay out what finance people need to know and how to kind of talk about this. But, you know, having the conversation early and often, it's not something that is nailed. It's not a totally solved problem. Like giant scaled companies who are spending millions and millions of dollars on cloud are still refining this. But I think it's about having the information out there so that it's not a, oh crap, at the end of the month the bill is this, that there's a discussion as it goes. Yeah.
The ROI is more than just a price savings opportunity, right? It's also a capacity thing. As customers get larger and larger and need to make sure their infrastructure is stable, like how are large customers balancing that choice between elasticity?
Yeah. It's a challenging one for sure. So the question is about RI savings versus the RI capacity you get. You basically get a preference to capacity when you buy a reservation. I think when you're optimizing for cost, you want to be looking across the entire consolidated billing structure. You want to see, you know, of all our linked accounts, how many M3, extra large, and US East 1A Linux are we using? Optimizing for capacity, before you actually buy the RIs, you want to see which accounts they're running in. And you essentially, you basically do your calculations across the whole account, but you buy in the account that needs the RI. So meaning you optimize across the master payer, but the linked account that needs the RI, you buy it there first. And what will happen then is that linked account gets a preference to use that RI before the other linked accounts. If they need it, it'll be there. If they don't, the other accounts will get the cost savings, but the capacity won't transfer. There's a lot of nuance in that also. Again, check out our blog, check out Amazon's site on it. There's different strategies depending on what you're trying to accomplish. Yeah.
Considering that most of that is based on linked accounts, but also on tagging, considering tagging, you know, only quite recently being widespread among all the resources, still few resources don't have it. How do you manage it? Why don't you use it?
Tagging has been around for a while, but I think you're right. I mean, only some resources, yeah. We've seen a bit of a shift, honestly, in the last year or two even. Opposite of what you'd expect. More resources are available to be tagged now, and yet we see more companies using linked accounts for chargeback rather than tags. They're still using tags, and tags are still important because of that compliance issue. Invariably, somebody is going to bypass the automation and fire up instances late at night via the console and not tag them, and nobody's going to notice. And so as much as possible, splitting out with linked accounts across the most important pieces, the things that you have to know, it's going to help. Now, there's technical constraints. Sometimes you can't have things in separate accounts. But this gets back to automation for tagging. Like, don't try and tag after the fact or anything like that. We just worked with some customers on this last week where they think everything is being tagged and it wasn't quite, you know, working. You know, setting it up so that those 2 to 3 tags have to go in before the resources go out.
Have you seen customers using all of those techniques to manage multi-tenant platforms where, you know, you really have lots of different clients using a common platform, and how do you apportion the cost of each of those clients?
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. I'd say that the biggest challenge is with reserved instances because they move around. You know, you buy one for one client, it may get applied elsewhere. We've seen people go as far as split out their consolidated accounts between clients. So for that second problem, which is I need to buy RIs just for this customer, I'm going to pull them out of my consolidated billing. Unfortunately, then you lose the opportunity for volume discounts and things like that. There's not really an easy answer other than being really specific about where you buy the RIs. For the multi-tenant aspect, you just need to basically get to a place where ideally you are tagging the shared resources as much as possible, and then ideally trying to figure out how much via your log data, you know, how much of each resource is being used by each group, and with a unit cost, you can then calculate their share of it. So there's some manual work there, but I think just you know, really getting early and actively consistent with whatever tag you can, whatever linked account structures you are going to start with, are going to give you the best divisions of spending from there. Anyone else? Oh, yes.
So I work with a lot of services clients, and
A lot of what clients?
Financial services.
Got it.
It's obviously a highly regulated business. They're looking at cloud, and it's rising in the last few years. It's something which we're looking into to this significant cost control or cost savings, right? I was wondering if you have any experience in terms of using this approach to cost control and monitoring to prove business case, or say, if we compare this to brick and mortar of what's currently in existence, this is how much you could save. I mean, I know I've experienced developing a model like that. I'm wondering if you know of anyone who's doing this kind of transition from traditional model to hybrid through full-on cloud, and looking at overall how am I optimizing my costs.
In order to do the comparison between the brick and mortar. I mean, I think that the debate about whether on-prem or cloud is a deep one. I mean, the thing that we always look at with this, and the companies that we work with a lot of large enterprises where we go in and they will have a data center and they will have AWS, and they're committed that they're going to have both for a long time. And there's two separate groups, and the data center group is really adamant what they're doing, cloud group is adamant. And over time, we see more and more stuff just end up going over to the Amazon side, because if you manage it effectively, it can be very cost effective. And outside of that, though, moving beyond that, all the resources that they suddenly free up. I mean, I've got one company I work with that they had a whole team building software to track this in the data center, and they moved everything to Amazon, and now that team is now supporting their products rather than supporting the data center. So, I mean, I think as much as possible, trying to steer that conversation away from just the direct apples-to-apples cost comparison, because it's not the same. You get the agility, you get the extra resources, you get those other savings. It's going to be helpful in that. In terms of specific resources, I think Amazon's probably a great resource for that as well. They've got tons of case studies. Check the website where people have moved and they've shown specific savings, over their brick and mortar installation. Great. Oh, one more.
Yeah, I'm just curious, for your enterprise customers that are trying to purchase RIs for cost savings opportunities, do you have a benchmark of allowable waste that you target when you work with them? Like, are you trying to get them to zero, or is 10% a reasonable number? Or?
Yeah, I mean, that's different for everybody. So what is the benchmark, in case you didn't hear, for companies with reserved instance purchasing? The talk I mentioned, the premise there on RIs is 95%. If you know what you're doing and you plan for scale and you're doing it really iteratively monthly, you can get there. We actually just launched a bunch of tools that are available now as of reInvent, brand new stuff, that will show you resource type by resource type, the percentage that's on demand versus RI utilization rates and all that. I think the short answer is you get it as high as you can. And every month you try and push it up further. It's going to be different for everybody based on how much they want to put up out front, to buy those RIs. Ideally, if you're optimizing on cost savings and you're not constrained on capital expenditure, you can get it 95%. You can get it pretty close.
Okay, so the 95% you're talking about, that's the number of RIs versus the amount on demand?
Yes.
Okay. So let's say, just to choose a number, 1,000 instances are what you need. So you try to get 950 RIs. Are you assuming that all 950 will be running all the time?
All 950 RIs or all 950 instances?
For some, because you're going to save money anyways, right? Like what you said about how the RIs are more cost effective than on demand. Is it reasonable to think that maybe only 900 of them will be running at a time?
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges and opportunities, because I'm an optimist, with RIs is that after you buy them, making sure you're actually using them, right? And making sure that, and that's where modifications come in, and looking at to see how how they're applied on a resource by resource and type by type basis, because it's we've seen a lot of folks get in the case where they're buying and buying and buying, and they look back and suddenly realize that 25% of them are not really being used. So I think really what you want to be doing is, as much as possible, assuming that your infrastructure is going to change. Things do not remain static. It's the cloud. Change is constant, and constantly adjusting your portfolio to match that. Great. I think I am short on time. I'll stay around afterwards for questions. And again, we do have a booth downstairs if you want to demo any of the products or want to chat further. Thanks a lot.